When I first saw the ranch, sprawling out under the wide Montana sky like something out of a dream, I knew I had found the place where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. It wasn't flashy, just 80 acres of rolling pastureland, a weathered red barn with a loft that smelled faintly of hay and old wood, a small creek winding lazily through the property, and a farmhouse that had been lovingly restored by its previous owners. I'd worked my whole adult life for this. 20 years in the military, followed by a second career in corporate security consulting that gave me the savings and the freedom to finally step away from city noise and politics. I wanted peace, quiet, and space to breathe. My real estate agent had mentioned the neighborhood HOA in passing, but said it was mostly about maintaining the community trail and keeping the entrance sign painted. I didn't think much of it. How bad could it be when the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away? On move-in day, the late summer air was warm and buzzing with cicadas, the kind of day that makes you want to work with your hands. I was unloading boxes from my trailer when I saw her for the first time. She came striding across my driveway like she owned the place. Tall, rigid posture, blonde hair in a perfectly sprayed helmet style, wearing oversized sunglasses and clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. "You must be the new tenant," she said, drawing out the last word like she'd just stepped in something unpleasant. I smiled politely and said, "Owner, actually. Name's Alex." She didn't smile back. "Well," she sniffed, looking me up and down as if measuring me against some invisible checklist. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. We have very strict community guidelines here. The HOA is responsible for maintaining property values, and we expect all residents to comply with the rules." I nodded, still trying to be neighborly. "I'm sure I'll get the hang of it. Just moved in today, looking forward to settling down." Her eyes narrowed. "We'll see. I'll be stopping by with a copy of the regulations, and I'll need to verify your occupancy is legitimate. We have had squatters before." I laughed lightly, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Without another word, she turned sharply on her heel and stalked back toward the main road. I figured she was just the type who liked to be in charge. Every neighborhood had one. But that night, while I was unpacking my kitchen, I noticed headlights sweeping up my driveway. It was a sheriff's cruiser. 2 deputies stepped out, hands resting on their belts, and one of them called out, "Evening. We got a call about possible trespassing on this property." My stomach dropped, partly from disbelief, partly from irritation. I met them halfway down the gravel drive, holding my driver's license in one hand and the thick folder of closing documents in the other. "I own this place," I said, handing over the paperwork. The deputies looked through the documents, verified the address, and nodded. "Everything checks out," one said, clearly a little embarrassed. "Your neighbor was concerned, I guess. Claimed she'd never seen you before and thought you might be here illegally." I could see the glow of Karen's porch light from down the road, and a shadow, probably her, lurking behind the curtain. I asked if I was in any kind of trouble, and they said no, not at all, just doing their due diligence. Before they left, one deputy muttered, "You're going to want to watch out for her. She calls about everything." After they drove away, I stood in the driveway for a long time, staring toward her house, the sound of crickets filling the air. It wasn't the welcome I'd imagined. The next morning, as the sun burned through the early mist, Karen was back, this time with a thick binder under her arm. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Per HOA regulations," she began, flipping the binder open to a page covered in fine print. "You are required to submit an application for any livestock, outbuildings, or fencing alterations. You are also limited to 2 vehicles visible from a street, and your grass must be maintained at a height no greater than 3 inches. I glanced at my pasture, where the grass easily reached my knees. "This is a ranch," I said, keeping my tone even. "It's supposed to look like this." She pursed her lips. "Not in Willow Creek. We have a standard to uphold." I took the binder and said I'd read it over, though my patience was wearing thin. That afternoon, I got a text from my agent apologizing. Apparently, she hadn't realized just how overbearing the HOA leadership could be. I shrugged it off, figuring once I proved I was a good neighbor, things would settle. But that night, as I sat on my porch with a beer, I saw Karen again, standing just beyond my property line, taking photos of my house with her phone. When she noticed me watching, she gave a little wave that was more smug than friendly, then walked away without a word. Over the next couple of days, I caught glimpses of her car creeping by at odd hours. And once I found a note taped to my mailbox reminding me to seek approval before making structural changes, as if moving in with my own furniture was some kind of offense. Then came the kicker. 3 days after I'd moved in, I got a certified letter from the HOA stating that I was in violation of multiple regulations, including failure to maintain lawn height and unauthorized parking of oversized vehicles, my pickup truck. The letter warned that fines could begin accumulating immediately if I didn't comply. I knew then this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a personal vendetta. I still didn't know why, but I had a strong suspicion it had less to do with grass height and more to do with the fact that Karen didn't like outsiders coming into her little fiefdom. The problem for her was I'd faced worse than an HOA president in my life. Much worse. And I wasn't about to be run off from the ranch I'd dreamed of for years. Still, for the time being, I decided to play it cool. I mowed a small strip of grass along the road, just to keep the peace, moved my truck behind the barn, and pretended to pore over the HOA handbook like an obedient new resident. But I also started keeping my own records, dates, times, photos, and copies of every letter she sent. If Karen wanted to make this a game, I was going to make sure I had the winning hand when the time came. I just didn't realize then how far she was willing to push it, or how badly it would backfire on her when she finally learned who I really was. At first, I thought maybe the initial hostility would burn itself out, that once Karen saw I wasn't some reckless neighbor with a rusted-out camper in the yard or parties every weekend, she'd back off. I was wrong. If anything, my quiet compliance seemed to irritate her more, as if she wanted to fight and my calm was denying her the satisfaction. Within a week, the letters started coming twice as often, warnings for unauthorized livestock because my 2 horses didn't have HOA-approved fencing, notices for excessive vegetation in areas of the pasture that weren't even visible from the road, and one absurd claim that my front porch furniture clashed with the community aesthetic. I started to see the pattern. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was manufacturing violations. One morning, I came out to find 3 black garbage bags dumped at the end of my driveway, ripped open so that old food containers and soggy paper spilled out into the gravel. I cleaned it up, but later, when I checked my trail camera near the gate, I caught a blurry image of Karen's SUV stopping there around midnight. She'd actually dumped trash on my property, then filed a complaint to the HOA that refuse was attracting pests. I kept the footage, adding it to my growing folder of evidence. And she didn't just target me on paper. She was physically present, lurking. I catch her standing by the fence line with her phone angled toward my barn, or slowly driving past my property multiple times a day. Once, she even walked right up to the barn under the pretense of inspecting compliance and started taking measurements of my fencing. When I told her she was trespassing, she sniffed and said, "As HOA president, I'm authorized to investigate rule violations anywhere in the community." I told her in no uncertain terms that unless she had a warrant or I invited her, she was not to set foot on my land again. She stormed off, muttering something about people who think they're above the rules. But it wasn't just the fines and the stalking. She went after my visitors, too. When an old Army buddy came to stay for a weekend, she cornered him at his truck and demanded to know his purpose on the premises, scribbling down his license plate. Another time, my niece drove out from the city to help me paint the inside of the barn, and Karen followed her car for nearly half a mile before she turned into my driveway. By then, the other neighbors had started to take notice. Some avoided me altogether, afraid, I guessed, of ending up on Karen's bad side. But a few would stop by and, in hushed tones, warn me that this was how she operated. One older gentleman, Bill, told me she'd driven out 3 different families in the last 5 years with constant harassment and legal threats. "She's got nothing better to do," he said, shaking his head. "Lives off her late husband's money, and running the HOA is her whole identity. She thinks she's the sheriff, the mayor, and the judge all rolled into one." The more I learned, the more I realized I wasn't dealing with just a nosy neighbor. This was a sustained campaign to make me leave, and I wasn't going anywhere. So I changed tactics. Instead of reacting to each provocation, I documented everything. Every letter was scanned and saved. Every time her SUV slowed by my driveway, it went on my security footage. I started wearing a body cam when I worked outside, just in case she confronted me. If she so much as looked at my horses too long, I made a note of the date and time. The more evidence I gathered, the more confident I felt, even as she escalated. And escalate she did. I came home one afternoon to find a bright orange HOA, final notice, posted on my front door, claiming I owed $4,700 in accumulated fines. The list included infractions like failure to repaint exterior in HOA-approved color palette. The farmhouse was white, as it had been for decades. Improper agricultural activity, apparently growing vegetables in the backyard, violated their landscaping code. And non-compliant holiday decor. I had a wind chime shaped like a cowboy boot. It would have been laughable if not for the fact that she clearly intended to use this bogus debt as leverage. That same week, I got a letter from an HOA-retained law firm threatening a lien on my property if I didn't pay up. That was my line in the sand. I knew how HOAs worked, and I knew exactly how to dismantle one when it crossed legal boundaries. But I also knew patience was key. If I moved too soon, she'd have a chance to cover her tracks. If I waited, she'd hang herself with her own rope. So I played along, even feigning frustration in public, so she'd think she was winning. Then, one Saturday afternoon, the perfect opportunity dropped into my lap. The HOA scheduled a mandatory community cleanup day. Volunteers were expected to help trim the walking trails and repaint the entrance sign. I showed up on time and wore gloves and boots and spent 3 hours hauling brush with a handful of other neighbors. Karen, of course, was overseeing the whole thing from under a wide-brimmed sun hat, barking orders like a drill sergeant. Toward the end, as people were packing up, she decided to make a little public scene. "Alex," she called loudly, so that everyone turned to look, "I need to speak with you about your ongoing non-compliance issues." She pulled a stack of papers from her tote bag and began reading off alleged violations. Lawn height, fencing unauthorized guests, even excessive equine odor, whatever that meant. I could feel the eyes of the other neighbors on me, some sympathetic, others curious. I didn't argue. I just let her talk, nodding occasionally, all the while noting how she was slandering me in a public setting. When she finally ran out of steam, I said evenly, "Karen, I hear your concerns. We can discuss them at the next HOA meeting, where I'll be prepared with all the necessary documentation." Something flickered in her expression. Was it doubt? But she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Very well," she said, clearly convinced she was setting me up for a public shaming. Over the next 2 weeks, her harassment reached a fever pitch. Daily letters. Anonymous complaints to the sheriff's office about loud construction noise that didn't exist. Even a claim to animal control that my horses were neglected. An officer came by, took one look at their glossy coats and clean stalls, and apologized for the waste of time. I could feel the tension building, like the pause before a storm breaks. She was driving herself into a frenzy, trying to find something that would stick. What she didn't realize was that I'd already set the stage for her undoing. I had a thick binder of evidence, not just of her false claims against me, but of her repeated trespassing, harassment of guests, misuse of HOA funds, thanks to some public records requests, and even a few instances where she'd violated her own HOA bylaws. And when the next meeting came around, it wouldn't just be me she had to answer to, it would be every single person in that room. The night of the HOA meeting arrived with a storm front rolling in from the west, the kind of sky that feels heavy with tension even before the rain hits. I've been preparing for this moment for weeks, not just collecting evidence, but organizing it into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss. The meeting was being held in the Willow Creek Community Center, a modest building near the entrance of the neighborhood, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and folding chairs arranged in tight rows. By the time I arrived, the room was already half full. Karen stood near the front, wearing her signature tailored blazer and holding court with a few of her loyal supporters. When she saw me walk in with a black leather briefcase under my arm, her eyes narrowed just a fraction, but she quickly plastered on that brittle smile. I took a seat near the front, directly facing the folding table where the HOA board sat. The meeting began in typical fashion. Approval of the previous minutes, a quick budget update, and a reminder about upcoming landscaping projects. Then came new business, and Karen seized her moment. "We need to address a matter that has been ongoing for several months," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "A matter of repeated non-compliance, disrespect for our community's rules, and behavior that threatens our property values." She gestured toward me, like a prosecutor pointing out the accused. "Mr. Alex here has been in violation since the day he moved in. Overgrown grass, unauthorized livestock, failure to submit proper permits for structural modifications, and a general disregard for our HOA standards. We have issued numerous notices, and yet he continues to flaunt our rules. I am recommending that we move forward with legal action to secure compliance, including placing a lien on his property, if necessary." A few people murmured, but others looked uncomfortable. I could feel the adrenaline building, but I kept my expression calm. When she finished her little speech, I raised my hand. "Madam President, may I respond?" She hesitated, clearly not expecting me to be so formal, then gave a curt nod. I stood, set my briefcase on the table, and began. "For the record, my name is Alexander Carter. I moved into the Willow Creek community on August 12th of this year. Since that time, I have received no fewer than 24 written notices of alleged violations, totaling over $4,700 in proposed fines." I opened a briefcase and began laying out documents, copies of every notice, photos of the same areas Karen had claimed were out of compliance, each with a date stamp showing they were in perfect order. I displayed the garbage dumping trail cam photo on the small projector I'd brought, the image of Karen's SUV frozen in grainy black and white as she dropped the bags at my gate. A ripple of whispers ran through the room. I showed stills from my security footage, her standing by my fence, trespassing on my land, taking photos of my barn, and even following my niece's car. In addition to these incidents, I continued, flipping to a section of printed financial statements I'd obtained through a public records request. I have evidence that HOA funds have been used for purposes outside the scope of the bylaws, including the purchase of landscaping services exclusively for the president's property, totaling $3,200 this year alone. Karen's face had gone pale under her makeup. "That is a gross misinterpretation," she snapped, but I held up a hand. "I'm not done. These repeated, unfounded violations constitute harassment under state law, and the trespassing incidents alone could justify criminal charges. I have not pursued that route yet because I wanted to give this board and this community the opportunity to address this matter internally." I let that hang in the air for a moment before delivering the part one knew would truly gut her position. For those who don't know, before retiring to this ranch, I spent 2 decades as a military intelligence officer, followed by 10 years in corporate security consulting. My clients included state governments, Fortune 500 companies, and yes, multiple HOA boards, usually to help them navigate complex legal disputes and avoid the exact kind of liability we're talking about here. I also happen to be the registered owner of Carter Legal Strategies, which specializes in property law and HOA litigation. In other words, Mrs. Whitmore, you've been picking a fight with someone who knows the rulebook inside and out, and helped write parts of it. The room was dead silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. I could see neighbors who'd been on the fence suddenly leaning forward, their eyes wide. I handed out printed packets to each board member, my compiled evidence, a formal request for the removal of the current president, and a motion to audit the HOA's finances. One of the board members, a middle-aged woman who'd looked uncomfortable during Karen's speech, cleared her throat. "I've seen enough," she said quietly. "I move that we remove Mrs. Whitmore as president, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." Another board member seconded it before Karen could get a word out. The vote was taken, 3 in favor, 1 abstention, and Karen's furious no. But the majority carried, and just like that, she was stripped of her title. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers with jerky movements, muttering about lawsuits and witch hunts as she stormed out into the rainy night. The rest of the meeting proceeded without her, and for the first time since moving in, I felt a sense of relief. But the story didn't end there. Within a week, I was contacted by the HOA's attorney, not to threaten me, but to request my assistance in restructuring the board and bringing the HOA back into compliance with state regulations. I agreed, on the condition that all outstanding violations against me be rescinded and the bogus fines erased. Not only did they agree, but they also issued me a formal apology in writing. Karen, I later learned, had moved out of Willow Creek altogether within 2 months. Her house sold quietly to a couple who seemed more interested in keeping to themselves. Life on the ranch settled into the rhythm I'd been craving. Morning rides with the horses, afternoons working the land, evenings on the porch with a cold drink and nothing but the sound of crickets. Every now and then, I'd pass by the old HOA office and see the new president, a practical man named Bill, waving as I drove by. The neighbors who'd once been wary now stopped to chat over the fence, and the air felt lighter without Karen's constant surveillance. And while I never went looking for a fight when I moved here, I had to admit there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that the very person who'd tried to drive me out had ended up packing her own bags instead. In the end, the ranch was mine, the peace was mine, and my little corner of Montana was finally the quiet refuge I'd always imagined, free from HOA tyranny, and especially free from Karen.